Welcome back to Nightfall History. Tonight we are going to talk about a paradox so perfectly, or a man that it could only have existed in Rome. A situation so strange that even people who lived through it found it slightly absurd, and they were a civilization that had already normalized gladiatorial combat, public baths, and eating while lying down. Tonight we are talking about Roman slaves, who were wealthier than Roman citizens. Slaves who ran banks. Slaves who owned businesses. Slaves who had their own slaves. Slaves who were in every practical sense that mattered in daily life more powerful, more comfortable, and more respected than many of the technically free men walking past them on the street. And we are going to talk about how this happened, why Rome allowed it, and what it tells us about a society that was simultaneously one of the most sophisticated and one of the most brutal in human history. Let us begin with what we think we know about Roman slavery, because the picture most people carry around is once again not quite right. The Roman slave as imagined by the modern mind is a figure of pure suffering. A man or woman in chains working a field or a mine, existing entirely for the comfort of a master who could do anything to them and frequently did. And this image is accurate. It is accurate for a very large number of Roman slaves, probably the majority. The agricultural slaves who worked the great estates of the Roman countryside lived lives of grinding misery. The mining slaves of Spain and Sardinia and other provinces worked in conditions so terrible that ancient writers who were not particularly sensitive to the suffering of slaves noted them as exceptionally harsh. These were people for whom slavery was exactly what the word has always meant: total subjugation, brutal labor, no future, no self. But Rome was a complicated place. And Roman slavery was a complicated institution. It contained within its vast and brutal structure a category of experience so different from the fields and mines that it barely seems like the same thing. The slaves of the Roman household, particularly the educated, skilled, and trusted ones, inhabited a world where the rules were different. Not fair, never fair, but different in ways that produced outcomes that nobody who hadn't studied Rome would predict. To understand how a slave could become wealthy in Rome, you first have to understand a Roman legal concept called the peculium. The peculium was in the simplest terms property that a master allowed a slave to hold and manage as if it were his own. It was not legally the slave's property legally. Everything a slave held belonged to his master, because in Roman law a slave could own nothing, be nothing, and have no legal existence whatsoever. The peculium was a kind of fiction that everyone agreed to maintain because it was useful. The master retained ultimate ownership in theory. The slave managed everything in practice. And what a slave could do with a peculium in the right circumstances was extraordinary. Imagine you are a Roman businessman of the first century. You have various commercial interests, a shipping operation, a few workshops making pottery or glass or cloth, a lending operation that advances money at interest perhaps, a share in a trading partnership. You need people to run these enterprises, people you can trust who will not steal from you, who have an incentive to make the business succeed, who are available at all hours and can be sent anywhere without the complications of hiring free men, who have their own interests and families and opinions about working conditions. You need, in other words, managers. The Roman solution was to use educated slaves. You found a slave who could read and write and do arithmetic perhaps. A Greek captured in one of Rome's eastern campaigns, since educated. Greeks were extremely common in the Roman slave market and were frequently snapped up for precisely this purpose. And you put him in charge of your business operation. You gave him a peculium to work with capital, to invest money, to lend funds, to purchase inventory. And then you let him run it. The slave had every incentive to run it well. If the business thrived, the master was happy and life was good. If it failed, the consequences fell on the slave first and hardest. More importantly, a master who wanted a genuinely motivated manager rather than a resentful one doing the minimum might explicitly promise that a portion of the profits would be added to the slave's peculium, gradually building toward a sum that might eventually be used to purchase freedom. The promise of manumission, official release from slavery, was the most powerful motivational tool available, and Roman masters used it constantly. So you had a slave who was managing a profitable business accumulating a peculium from his share. of the profits and working toward eventual freedom with genuine enthusiasm. And in the meantime, he was making decisions, hiring and firing workers, extending credit to customers, negotiating prices with suppliers, taking on partners, perhaps opening additional locations. He was in every practical business sense an entrepreneur, just one who was legally owned by someone else. This arrangement had a name, the actio institutoria, a legal principle that allowed a slave to make binding commercial commitments on behalf of his master. When the slave signed a contract, the master was legally bound by it. When the slave borrowed money for the business, the master was responsible for the debt. This gave the slave manager genuine commercial authority because everyone who dealt with him knew his agreements were backed by his master's assets. He was essentially operating as an authorized agent of a wealthy Roman with all the credibility that implied. Now, let us talk about what this looked like in practice, because the abstract principle is interesting, but the human details are more. So, the city of Rome was full of shops and workshops lining the ground floors of apartment buildings, the same apartment buildings where ordinary Romans lived in cramped upper floors, collecting water from public fountains because there was no plumbing, eating bread from the bakeries downstairs because there was no kitchen space to cook. These shops, tabernae they were called, were frequently operated by slaves. A baker's slave ran the bakery. A fuller's slave managed the cleaning shop. A banker's slave sat at the table in the forum and handled deposits and loans and money changing. The entire commercial infrastructure of the city was substantially staffed and often managed by enslaved people. Some of these slaves accumulated peculia of remarkable size. We know this partly from legal texts that had to establish what happened. When a slave with a large peculium died, or when a master died, or when a slave was sold, all these events required working out the complicated question of who actually owned what. The legal texts reveal incidentally that slaves sometimes had peculia large, enough to make the disposition of them a serious legal matter rather than a trivial one. And then there was the phenomenon of slaves owning slaves, which is the detail that tends to stop people cold when they first encounter it. If a slave was managing a business operation that required more hands than he could provide himself, he might be authorized or might simply have the standing to acquire additional slaves to work under him. These were called vicari, meaning substitutes or deputies, and they were common enough in Roman commercial life that the legal system had to develop specific rules for dealing with them. The vicarius was owned technically by the master of the slave who managed him, but the slave manager was the vicarius' actual supervisor, the person who directed his work and managed his daily existence. The legal ownership was one step removed from the practical reality. A slave who had a peculium large enough to purchase a vicarius and use that vicarius to expand his business operation was in a position not entirely unlike a modern middle manager who has both a boss above him and staff below him. He was simultaneously subject to authority and the exercise of it. He had power over at least one other human being, economic resources of real substance, and daily responsibilities that went far beyond anything most free Roman citizens would ever handle. Because here's the other side of this story: most free Roman citizens were not wealthy. This is the thing that tends to get lost when we talk about Rome. We talk about the senators and the equestrians and the great families with their country villas and their art collections and their political careers. But the actual population of Rome was overwhelmingly poor. The free poor, called proletari, a word that has had an interesting subsequent career, owned. Essentially nothing, lived in rented apartments that were cold and dark and frequently caught. Fireworked irregular day labor when they could find it, and survived in part on the grain dole, the free or subsidized grain distribution that the Roman state maintained to keep its urban population from starving and rioting. These were free men. Free Roman citizens with the right to vote in assemblies, which meant less than it sounds, because the assemblies were structured to give wealthy citizens massively more weight than poor ones. They had the right to live in Rome without being owned by anyone. They had the right to call themselves Romans, which was worth something socially, but not much economically. And in daily practical terms, many of them had less money, less food security, less quality of housing, and less professional stability than a well-positioned urban slave who who managed a profitable business and had a growing peculium and a reasonable prospect of eventual freedom. The Roman writer Petronius, in his novel The Satirican, gives us a character called Trimalchio, who is one of the great comic creations of ancient literature. Trimalchio is a former slave who has been freed of Libertas and who has since become enormously wealthy through business and investment. He throws a dinner party of such extravagant and slightly tasteless excess that it has become the image of a certain kind of nouveau-riche vulgarity. He serves course after course of preposterous food. He has an orchestra playing. He reads out his will to his guests. He pretends to be dead to see how people will react. He is, in short, impossible. And he is also clearly recognizable Petronius's. Original readers would have immediately identified the type, because former slaves who had made fortunes were a visible and somewhat irritating presence in Roman commercial life. Trimalchio tells his guests over dinner about his life. He arrived in Rome as a slave with nothing. He was put to work in his master's household. He made himself useful, educated himself, gained his master's trust. He was eventually freed, inherited a portion of his master's estate, and invested it in shipping. A whole fleet of ships all lost in a storm. He lost everything and started again. He rebuilt, invested in land, in banking, in various enterprises, and ended up richer than most of the old Roman families who looked down on him. His guests at the dinner party are themselves not very high-status people. Petronius gives them names and speech patterns that mark them as freedmen and merchants and people of the middle sort, but even to them, Trimalchio is a figure of slight comedy, someone who has more money than taste and cannot quite suppress his origins. The comedy is real, and Petronius intends it. But underneath the comedy is a social observation of some weight. This is a man who was property, who was owned, who had no legal existence, and who ended up controlling more wealth than senators' sons who had never worked a day in their lives. Roman system had produced this outcome, and enough people found it funny and familiar that Petronius could build a novel around it. Let us talk about specific categories of slave whose positions were particularly remarkable, because the general picture needs particular examples to feel real. The imperial slaves and freedmen are perhaps the most dramatic case. The emperors of Rome were obviously extraordinarily powerful. They were also running an empire of several million people spread across 3 continents, and they needed administrators. Lots of them, reliable ones. Men who could be trusted absolutely, who had no independent political base to threaten the emperor's position, who could be controlled and disposed of, if necessary, without the political complications that came with disposing of a senator or a general. The emperors began using their own slaves and freedmen as administrators on a scale that eventually alarmed the Senate deeply. The emperor's household included slaves and former slaves who managed correspondence, supervised finances, ran the imperial treasury, handled petitions from across the empire, and administered departments that functioned effectively as a civil service. These men had access to the emperor, handled sensitive information, made decisions that affected the whole empire, and received gifts and gratitude from people across the Roman world who wanted imperial favor. The freedmen Narcissus and Pallas, who served under the emperor Claudius, became 2 of the most powerful and wealthy men in Rome, and they had both been slaves. Pallas reportedly had accumulated assets that dwarfed the fortunes of most noble families. Narcissus was said to have been wealthier than Crassus, who was so famously rich that his name became synonymous with wealth. Whether these specific figures are accurate matters less than the fact that these men existed, were known to be extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, and that this was considered remarkable but not impossible within the Roman system. Senators hated it. The old Roman aristocracy found the whole situation deeply offensive. Men who had been property, who had no lineage, who came from nowhere and nothing, were nothing at the emperor's elbow in deciding who got an audience and which petitions were worth the emperor's time. They had more practical power than generals and governors and men whose ancestors had held consulships. They were to the aristocrats an insult made manifest. The Senate periodically passed resolutions or made speeches about the dignity of the Roman state and the impropriety of freedmen. Holding such positions, the emperors, who needed efficient administrators more than they needed the Senate's approval, generally ignored this. The world of Roman banking and finance also produced slave and freedmen, wealth on a significant scale. Roman banking was not organized through formal institutions in the modern sense. There were no central banks, no chartered corporations. It was organized through individuals who sat at tables in the forum or in the market and offered services money-changing deposit-holding lending. The argentieri and numularii who ran these operations frequently employed slaves and freedmen, and those employees in turn built their own client relationships, their own networks of borrowers and depositors, their own reputations for reliability. A reputation-based commercial world, and Rome was emphatically that a reliable slave banker who had been operating in the same spot for 10 years, who paid his deposits back on time and made his loans on reasonable terms, might have a better commercial reputation than a free man who had just arrived in Rome with nothing but his legal status. The market did not particularly care about your legal identity. It cared about whether you would pay what you owed. There was also the phenomenon of the educated slave, whose skills were so valuable that his market price, and therefore his potential purchase price for self-redemption, was enormous. A highly educated Greek, philosopher or rhetorician, who had been enslaved and was working as a private tutor to a wealthy family's children was worth a great deal. A skilled architect or a physician, or a trained accountant commanded prices that reflected their economic value. These were people whose intellectual labor was so valuable that their owners had strong incentives to keep them happy, give them reasonable living conditions, and hold out the possibility of eventual freedom to maintain their motivation. The philosopher Epictetus was a slave. He was owned by a freedman of Nero, who was himself a powerful imperial administrator, which gives you a sense of how these layers could stack. Epictetus later wrote, or rather dictated since his lectures were recorded, by a student one of the most significant works of Stoic philosophy, discussing with considerable practical authority the distinction between things within our control and things outside it. He knew something about things outside one's control. He had been one of them. He was eventually freed. He lived modestly, taught students who came from wealthy and prominent families, and in his philosophy specifically argued that external circumstances, wealth, status, freedom, slavery were less important than the inner life. He was either genuinely at peace with his past or making the best of available arguments, and possibly both. Epictetus was a philosopher, which made him unusual in many respects. Most slaves who accumulated wealth and influence did so through commerce rather than intellectual production. And the commercial path to prosperity was paradoxically more reliable than the intellectual one, because commerce produced measurable results that masters had direct financial incentive to reward, while intellectual brilliance was nice, but not necessarily monetizable in the same direct way. The process of manumission freedom is worth spending some time on because it was both more common in Rome than in many other slave societies and more complicated than a simple binary between slave and free. The Roman master could free a slave in several ways. He could do it formally through a legal ceremony. He could do it informally with a word or a letter. He could include it in his will, which meant the slave became free upon the master's death. The Romans freed slaves with some regularity, so much so that the emperor Augustus eventually placed legal restrictions on the practice, because the number of freedmen becoming Roman citizens was considered to have gotten slightly out of hand. When a slave was formally freed, he became a libertus, a freedman, and acquired a specific legal status that was better than slave, but below that of the freeborn citizen. He took his former master's family name, which is why we can often identify freedmen. In inscriptions, they have a Roman name, but also a note of their former master's name. He could not hold certain offices or honors reserved for the freeborn. His children, however, were fully freeborn citizens with no such restrictions. The stigma of slave origin was, legally speaking, one generation deep, and in practice, many freedmen did extremely well. They had skills, networks, business experience, capital accumulated in their peculium, and frequently a warm, ongoing relationship with their former master, who was now their patron, and who had social and legal obligations to them, just as they had obligations of service and respect to him. A former slave freed by a wealthy and well-connected master entered the world with social backing that many freeborn poor men could could not match. Freed slaves went into business. They became contractors, merchants, craftsmen who employed other craftsmen. They became the backbone of the Roman commercial middle class, the people who actually ran shops and workshops and bakeries and laundries, and all the other enterprises that kept a city of 1 million people functioning. The old aristocratic families looked down on trade and commerce as beneath their dignity, which meant they left. Enormous commercial opportunity on the table that energetic, experienced, motivated freedmen were delighted to pick up. By some estimates, the commercial economy of Rome in its imperial period was substantially shaped by freed slaves and their descendants. The merchant inscriptions, the burial markers, listing occupations and achievements, the commercial records that survive, they are full of names that mark their bearers as freedmen or the children of freedmen. These are the people who built the economic infrastructure of the empire, while the senators were busy writing speeches about the dignity of old families. There is a certain irony in the fact that Rome, which depended on slavery so completely and so brutally, also created through its specific version of the institution a pathway narrow, uncertain, available only to a minority, from total subjugation to substantial prosperity. The system that produced the horrors of the mining camps and the agricultural estates also produced Trimalchio and Narcissus and the nameless slave banker who had been sitting in the same spot in the forum for 15 years and whose word was worth more in a commercial transaction than a free man's legal oath. Rome did not do this out of generosity or enlightenment. It did it because it was practical. Motivated slaves performed better than resentful ones. The peculium system created incentives that pure coercion could not. The prospect of freedom gave people a reason to invest in their own competence and their master's success. And the manumission system produced a class of experienced, skilled, well-networked freedmen who went on to perform enormous economic services for Roman society. It was exploitation engineered with great sophistication. The slaves who benefited from it were the lucky minority, the ones whose skills or circumstances placed them in positions where the system's incentive structure happened to work in their favor. The vast majority of Roman slaves in the fields and the mines, on the rowing benches of ships, knew nothing of peculia and manumission and freedmen's commercial networks. Their experience of Roman slavery was precisely as terrible as the straightforward version implies, but the complicated version existed alongside the brutal one. Both were real. Both were Roman. And understanding both is necessary to understand how a city of 1 million people, without modern communications, without corporations, without banks in the institutional sense, somehow functioned. It functioned partly because the people who actually ran it day to day were often technically owned by the people who nominally controlled it. The senator gave the speech. The slave manager ran the business. The emperor issued the decree. The imperial freedmen handled the correspondence. Rome was at its operational core, frequently run by people who were not legally free, which says something interesting about the distance between legal status and lived reality, about how systems built on one principle can produce outcomes that contradict it at every practical level, about how the word freedom can mean very different things, depending on whether you are a citizen living in poverty on the 4th floor of a Roman tenement, eating state grain and owning nothing, or an enslaved manager of a profitable trading operation whose peculium is growing and whose master has promised his freedom in 5 years and is a man of his word. Both men were real. Both men walked the same streets of Rome. The free man's legal status was real and meaningful, and was certainly better than the alternative. But the slave's practical circumstances in this particular comparison were arguably more comfortable. Rome contained both of these men simultaneously, and did not find the contradiction especially troubling. The Romans were very good at not being troubled by contradictions. It was one of their defining qualities. Thank you for spending this night with Nightfall History. The past has a way of arranging its hierarchies in patterns that seem obvious until you look closely and then become strange. Sleep well, and we will find another strange corner of history to explore together very soon.